Hello, everyone. I'm Nabila, and we have Avery and Vanessa here. Welcome to Through the Broken Mirror. We're diving into an important topic that bridges psychology, biology, and society: body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD. To guide us through this complex subject, we had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Casera, a board-certified psychiatrist who specialized in college mental health at UNC CAPS and outpatient and inpatient eating disorders. She is also involved with medical student education as the Associate Clerkship Director for the Medical Student Psychiatry Rotation. She has given us consent to share with you our recorded discussion. As we continue discussing BDD, we will discuss how ecological niche applies to BDD. But first, what is an ecological niche? According to Hacking, an ecological niche refers to the specific social and cultural conditions that allow a particular kind of human category, like a mental illness, to flourish or be recognized as a distinct phenomenon. Essentially, is the set of social factors that enable a certain classification of people to exist and be understood within a given time and place. Much like how a biological niche accommodates a specific species in an ecosystem. To start off the podcast, we asked Dr. Casera some basic questions, and these were her responses.
The diagnosis of BDD entails a couple of different things. And in order to formally diagnose it, you need to meet all of these criteria. So there is a preoccupation with some sort of perceived flaw in appearance. And the key there is that it is not observable to others. So it's someone with they look in the mirror, they think they have whatever this perceived flaw is. And then the other thing that it comes with is an alteration in functionality. So you might have noticed this throughout the course that y'all have been taking, that a lot of our psychiatric diagnoses have this final criteria that they alter psychosocial functionality in some way. And the way that this shows up in BDD is usually some form of repetitive behaviors, checking mechanisms, looking in a mirror, checking your phone's camera, looking at yourself, or some form of mental act in response to whatever the appearance concern is. And when we think about the population that's affected by this, and kind of in an American context, we are seeing folks usually in the teenage years being diagnosed with this, but research has shown that a subclinical BDD diagnosis can typically come around the age of 12 or 13. And what that means is it's criteria for BDD that don't fully meet the diagnosis yet, but will probably evolve into that. So this is a complicated answer. I think that there are so many people who just go undiagnosed. So we really rely on kind of targeted research initiatives to be able to actually see who meets criteria, because a lot of people are just not showing up to their doctor's offices or their psychiatrist, whoever, complaining of these symptoms, right? It's usually observed by someone else who's pointing it out. But within the American context and within the groups that we know we have studied to see who has BDD, the groups that were kind of named as highest prevalence were actually people who were presenting for oral or maxillofacial surgery, people who were seeing a dermatologist regularly, people who were going to a cosmetic surgeon. And in those groups, we were looking at closer to a 10% prevalence. So 1 in 10. Picture someone who's living in a bigger body, who's going to their primary care doctor's office. They're seeing their PCP for just their annual checkup. They get their height measured, they get their weight checked, they get their vital signs, all of that checked. And they're already thinking about what their weight is as they're going into this appointment. And then the doctor comes into the office and starts to go through, whatever list of things that they're supposed to check in about, talking about prevention of chronic conditions, that type of thing. Let's say this patient has stone cold lab values, their blood work is all fine. They don't have any symptoms of any chronic conditions. Research has shown that in spite of all of this, just solely based off of the fact that they live in a bigger body, there is a very high likelihood that their primary care doctor is going to instruct them to lose weight. They're going to suggest weight loss as a treatment to something that does not exist. They're probably going to tell them to exercise more, watch their diet, recommend apps like MyFitnessPal, Noom. Now, I'm going to add a caveat to that. Let's say the person has a known diagnosis of BDD or a known diagnosis of an eating disorder. Now we go back through that example that I just gave with that new mindset, and we have this realization of being told to lose weight, to exercise more, to eat different, can actually be really, really problematic and detrimental to their health. For someone who already has distorted cognitions about the way that they look, the way that their size presents, that's just something that can be incredibly detrimental. And we know time and time again, research has actually shown that prescribing weight loss is essentially the same thing as prescribing an eating disorder. But that folks who are supposed to be, taking care of patients who have some of these diagnoses can oftentimes make it worse without even realizing it, because they are told that they are supposed to be a specific weight or a specific size.
Okay, to get us started, I'll be discussing the societal vector through the perfectionist standards. In the US, individuals with BDD are preoccupied with what they see as flaws in their physical appearance. They believe they look ugly or abnormal, even though these flaws are not noticeable or minor to others' perception. Due to the emphasis of physical attractiveness and unrealistic/narrow appearance ideals in Western society, individuals may compare themselves to others and develop body dissatisfaction if they perceive themselves to be less attractive. This creates a niche for developing body image disorders potentially. Social media and media consistently depict perfection and the ability to fix flaws through online filters and other technology. This perfectionist standard creates an environment where people are reluctant to discuss their problems with a healthcare professional and get treatment. So these are the questions that I decided to ask Dr. Casera regarding societal factors, which are...
It plays a big role, but probably not the only role. I think there are a lot of assumptions that are made about what physical ideals are. And there's a large degree of reinforcement for looking a certain way, right? Like this is something that is it's happening all the time. Like someone saying something as seemingly harmless as, wow, you look great, after seeing you, after some time, that's such a loaded statement. Like there is so much behind the wow, you look great. Does that mean that I look, skinnier? Does that mean that my skin looks better? Does that mean that, I just got this nose job and now my nose looks awesome? Like there's so much behind that statement. So I think that by itself, yes, that is huge as a societal pressure. But that being said, we also know that not everyone who is exposed to the same societal influences develops BDD, right? Not everyone has body dysmorphic disorder. So that tells us that there are other factors that are at play. And so to answer the question, societal pressures, yes, they play a huge role in kind of achieving this like quote unquote ideal. And I think the other part of it that needs to be present is more on the line of like cognitive thinking, cognitive patterns. One time there might have been like a singular standard for what's considered to be beautiful, for what's considered to be attractive. Influencers maybe 10 15 years ago probably all looked a certain way, but I think as we've watched this trend of influencers just exponentially increase, I don't think we're actually seeing a singular gold standard of individual anymore, right? So I think social media being so much more prevalent across countries, across nations, across continents, we are seeing different standards of beauty showing up more and more when we're, scrolling through reels on our phones. And so I actually think that that might have added more of a protective layer in how people are viewing themselves. Now, that is not to say that social media doesn't come with its downsides. That is a whole other topic. Yes, it absolutely does. But I think that having a wider reach and the popularity of influencers and this trend that's coming on, it might not necessarily be an all bad thing. I think there might be some layers of protection there. I think when we think about Western beauty culture, there's so many different definitions and kind of niches within Western culture now. And I can say, like, for myself, very personally, that the standards that I grew up with, I was an immigrant to the United States. I grew up in Salt Lake City, which was a, relatively homogenous in terms of race and appearances type of place. What I grew up with, the standards that I saw for what beauty was a lot different than I think what a lot of my counterparts in Salt Lake City might have seen. Um, so I think it's hard to say for, Western culture specifically and how it compares to other cultures, but I will say I think elements of other cultures are kind of trickling into the Western beauty standard. And again, with what we are seeing with influencers from around the world, I think our own definitions of beauty are expanding. And the other thing I wanted to add is the diagnosis of BDD in the US actually has like counterparts in other countries. And so other countries have their own diagnoses of BDD in different languages. Japan has one. And the term that they use in Japan that kind of correlates to what we call BDD here in America, literally translates to phobia of deformed body. And so I found that to be interesting. That was something that I was just researching before I hopped on this call. So all of that to say, I think the development of BDD can happen wherever you are, whatever country you're in. And our Western standard is evolving and shifting.
Thanks, Nabila, for covering the societal vectors. We will now cover the cultural vectors. One of those being the minority stress theory, which states that individuals experience stress from the stigmatization of their minority status. This leads to adverse mental and physical health outcomes. Research highlights that factors such as harassment, discrimination, rejection, and the need to conceal one's identity significantly attributes to these adverse effects. For instance, when individuals perceive themselves as different, they attempt to conform to Western beauty standards, historically associated with pale and light skin tones. They may begin to view their unique features as incompatible with Western ideals, and this can drive their efforts to alter their appearance, which further exacerbates feelings of inadequacy and stress that are commonly associated with BDD. Another cultural vector is the cross-cultural context. In Brazil, the prevalence of BDD is in its clinical population at a facility specializing in obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders was about 12%. Brazil is the second biggest consumer of plastic surgery, and doctors are now offering cosmetic procedures and services to impoverished Brazilians at discounted rates. Additionally, cosmetic procedures cost an average of 2/3 less than procedures in the United States, making it a hotspot for tourists to have their procedures completed. A facelift in Brazil costs approximately $3,000 compared to a facelift in the United States, which ranges from $7,000 to $15,000.
Thanks, Nabila and Vanessa, for covering the social and cultural vectors with Dr. Casera. We didn't heavily touch on the economic and medical environments and conditions that can cause or assist in BDD's prevalence in different areas, though. Now, let's start by thinking about it broadly. Economics can be worked into any sort of explanation as to why things happen or why they don't, and I would argue that BDD is no exception here. There are many ways that someone's experience with BDD is shaped by their financial situation. Now, on an extremely broad scale, and this is a bit of an extreme example, how great of a concern can BDD be given other greater concerns in a person's life? So if a person lives in a war-torn country where the extent of healthcare is humanitarian aid and hospital-like settings, room for BDD treatment and therapy is probably non-existent. And now on the other side of things, highly developed countries that have an abundance of dermatologists, like Dr. Casera mentioned, or plastic surgeons allow for BDD to persist as long as the patient can pay for the treatment. Now, cosmetically, people with BDD will attempt to cover, emphasize, or change their appearance physically, but as nothing is free in this world, without financial ability to take part in these treatments, procedures, therapies, makeups, etc., BDD could arguably go undiagnosed and therefore unrecognized. It also requires a medical environment of a certain level, one that surpasses basic need and allows for specializations such as psychiatry. Now, this idea is supported by the research conducted by Luana Marquez, Hilary M. Weingarten, Nicole J. LeBlanc, and Sabine Wilhelm for the Journal of Psychosomatic Research in 2010. They conducted a cross-sectional internet study of individuals with symptoms consistent with BDD diagnosis to investigate treatment utilization and barriers. What they found from the 401 individuals that participated was 49.9% worried about the cost of possible treatment, and these percentages were higher among some ethnic minority groups, such as Latinos. There were also great concerns around if health insurance would even cover forms of treatments across 47.1% of the total group. This goes to show that although acknowledgement of BDD-type symptoms might lead individuals to seek out treatment options, barriers such as financial means can stand in the way. This could potentially cause the disorder to further worsen and would have even greater impacts on some ethnic minority groups. This led us to ask Dr. Casera, how does the concept of the ecological niche apply to BDD in today's society? Now, reflecting on what we've already talked about, are there particular environments, social, cultural, medical, where BDD is more prevalent or intense?
When we think about the etiology of BDD, so the cause of it, where it's coming from, or really any psychiatric diagnosis, we have something called the biopsychosocial model, which y'all might be familiar with. This is our way of just conceptualizing the various factors that kind of pile on to contribute to the development of this disorder. And the bio part of it is like biological factors, right? Genetic stuff. And I know you said you were focusing less on that. The psycho part is the psychological factors. The social part is social factors. So for BDD specifically, when we think about the bio part of it, we know that the prevalence of BDD is higher in people who have a family history of OCD, and even more specifically, people who have a first degree relative with OCD. And so that's why it makes great sense too that we're putting this diagnosis within the subcategory of OCD spectrum disorders now. When we think about the environmental standpoint, so that's more of like the social part of the biopsychosocial model, we're thinking about what we know about BDD and being associated in folks who have higher rates of childhood abuse or trauma, adverse childhood outcomes, experiences, and then leading to this as an outcome. So all of these things, I think, are things that we think about when we're thinking about specific situations that lead to a diagnosis of BDD.
Now, like all conditions, sicknesses, and disorders, people experience their symptoms differently, forming individualized illness experiences that look different from person to person. And we briefly discussed what common illness experiences look like for patients with BDD and asked Dr. Casera what actions she sees most commonly taken in terms of treatment. Now, let's hear what she has to say on that.
Therapy. Medications are helpful for the comorbidities, kind of like Vanessa identified earlier that there are a lot of comorbidities associated with BDD. So we've got antidepressants, we've got anti-anxiety medications, we've got meds that help with OCD type stuff. But really they are the most effective when used in conjunction with therapy. So I think most frequently people are, at least the patients that I see, are frequently more readily accepting of therapy as opposed to medications. And again, there's probably a whole hour-long session we could talk about the stigma associated with psych meds, but I think I would say therapy most commonly. And the other part of it too is, if it's a kid, if it's a teenager, for example, and their parents are the ones that are more in control of their treatment options, like family dynamics would play a gigantic role in what treatment these people are getting, right? If you have parents who are opposed to medications, but the kid wants to be on a medication, that could be an instance in which a patient doesn't get a med, even though they need it.
Well, that wraps up our discussion on body dysmorphic disorder. By stepping back and analyzing the disorder from an anthropological lens, we can see how the implications of social, cultural, and economic vectors facilitate the existence of BDD. This is not to minimize the importance of biology, genetics, and personal factors that play a role in the mental illness, only to provide an alternative perspective to help understand BDD more holistically. We want to once again thank Dr. Casera for her time and insights, allowing us to dive deeper into our research and hear from an expert. We hope you've enjoyed our podcast and really learned something new from our discussion. Now we will have time for some questions and answers. Bye!